Thank you very much for your productive cooperation. Good afternoon, everybody. Oh, I must say that is there somewhere around? No.
Not yet.
Okay, I must say that I hate presenting after Dermot Turing. He usually exploits the subject until the very end. He does so in a very attractive way which is absolutely impossible to achieve for a non-English speaker. But I will do my best to present you some remnants of the subjects left by Dermot Turing. Well, we will cover, we will or probably we will not.
It's going.
Oh,
Yeah.
It's interesting because nothing happens at my screen. There is much confusion about who really broke Enigma. We keep on hearing stories that, well, did it not, thought that Poles were reading Enigma simply by luck. Some other stories invented in mid-1970s go that a Polish mechanic was working in Berlin in a factory where Enigma machine was being manufactured. And as an element of the staff review, he has been fired by his boss for being Polish. In Warsaw, he was able to find a contact person representing British Secret Service and offered his services to the British. Then, for God knows how, he was smuggled to Paris when he was installed in a workshop, was given a carpenter to look after him, and he was creating a wooden mock-up model of Enigma. I'm serious. There are many reasons for that deep shroud of confusion surrounding the real story of Enigma. You know, Dermot was very lucky because he was writing his book 10 years after mine. And I could give my book a title, Enigma, Closer to the Truth, while Dermot was describing a real story of Enigma. Those 10 years brought a real difference. Much more source material is available right now. So we can concentrate on the reasons why things got so complicated that we are now recreating that history, that real history, from the scarce existing sources. First of all, the Polish team was sidetracked in 1940. In fact, after 1940, after the fall of France, Poles hardly participated in the Enigma breaking process. Yes, they were breaking some ciphers, working in the clandestine code-breaking center organized by the Vichy France, somewhere in the southern France, but they hardly contributed to the Enigma breaking. They were breaking the ciphers which of some particular interest for their French supervisors. And if you are away from the main activities in a given area, your ration and your voice does not count. Then, Dermot was talking about a meeting in Piri, held in July 1939. A very important meeting in the history of Enigma, because it was precisely during that meeting that Poles revealed before their French and British equivalents their entire knowledge, all the theory behind Enigma code breaking, the construction of several ingenious devices they constructed to facilitate breaking of the cipher. There were 3 people on the British side that participated in that meeting, and none of them was available at Bletchley Park after the war, when the reports from the wartime activities of the sections of Bletchley Park were being compiled. Tyrianox passed away during war. Denniston was also sidetracked in 1942 and sent to supervise a section responsible for breaking diplomatic ciphers only. So he didn't participate. Therefore, those people who are responsible for for the compilation of the post-war reports about the wartime activities of Bletchley Park knew about the meeting in period from the second hand only. And that second hand was a very particular hand because it was mostly Alan Turing. This is a fragment of one of those reports, Hut 6 history, history of Hut responsible for breaking of Wehrmacht and Luftwaffe ciphers. Most of the information about the pre-war activities of Polish Cipher Bureau I have collected about pre-war days comes from them through Turing, who joined the GCCS in 1939. But Turing was a lamentable explainer, according to the same author. And therefore, those fragments of knowledge about the Polish contribution to Enigma code breaking are hardly preserved in a post-war report compiled at Bletchley Park. There is much of confusion. For instance, one of those reports states that most of the information required for breaking the Enigma ciphers Poles have gained through the secret agents. Another opinion about the communication skills of Alan Turing. The latter demonstrates clearly Turing's almost total inability to make himself understood. Under normal circumstances, it was intellectual leader of the team was Marian Rejewski, who should have written the history of the pre-war activities in the area of Enigma code breaking. Unfortunately, after World War II, Rejewski took a very difficult decision. He decided to get back to the Poland under the communist control. And as at the recent stage of the World War II, he contributed somehow to breaking of the Soviet ciphers, he was playing a very dangerous game because he was subject to continuous supervision on the part of the communist secret police. And he could say a few words about his pre-war activities, but it was very dangerous for him to talk about the latest period. And therefore, he waited for a very, very long time before revealing his participation in this adventure. And it was only after he retired in 1967. He then filed a report from his pre-war activities. I would like to underline pre-war activities only at the Historical Institute of the Polish Army. But he didn't say a word about what he's been doing in the last stage of World War II. Then, when the story finally came to light due to the publication of the book by Gustave Bertrand, we've heard about a lot during Dermot's presentation. Bertrand wrote a book in 1973 underlying his own role in Enigma code breaking. To some extent, that statement is of course justified, but I don't think that Dermot has any idea of mathematics. It was mathematics that permitted breaking of Enigma. So the English-speaking world had two problems with that book. The first problem is that the book was an element of the traditional French-British antipathy. And in fact represented a very interesting attack on some of the British values, some of the British achievements. But the second problem was much more important. It was 1973. The Cold War was at full swing, and both sides in Cold War were using the ciphering machines directly coming from the Enigma construction. Rotor machines were at that time absolutely popular. They represented the mainstream of the cryptography, still in 1970s. And therefore, admitting in public that Enigma was broken was like advertising to your cryptological enemy, hey, your ciphers are in danger, beware. It couldn't be allowed. And therefore, American and British secret services responded with an absolutely classical answer of that part of our world with disinformation. And the disinformation was arranged in a very spectacular form. They probably persuaded ex-members of their own service to write a book presenting the story in slightly distorted fashion. It is from the Frederick Winterbottom's book, published in 1974, the history about the Polish mechanic who was assisted by a carpenter to manufacture a wooden mock-up of Enigma. I quote it. We know, however, that there existed a piece of evidence, written piece of evidence, that would present this history in an absolutely historically true fashion. Before the meeting in Pyry in July 1939, Polish codebreakers were commissioned by the commanding officers to prepare a report describing in full entire extent of their knowledge, entire extent of their experience with the German cipher. And the funny part about the document is that it was written in German, because the first meeting of the codebreakers of Poland, Britain, and France clearly demonstrated that they are able to communicate only using the language of their common adversary, German. Poles didn't speak English. The French didn't speak any other languages than French. And the British didn't speak Polish. This is a fragment of one of those reports compiled at Bletchley Park in 1945. And it recounts that their account of the system, written in stilted German, still exists. It still existed in probably June, July or August 1945, when Peter Mahan, author of those words, was compiling his report. But that statement in one of the post-war reports is the last trace of the report compiled by Polish codebreakers before the outbreak of World War II and passed over to their French and British counterparts. Since then, that report vanishes from our horizon of events. It's, I hope, understandable for you that many Polish historians spent numerous hours at the archives of the ex-Allied countries trying to find that report. To no avail. That report either remains unavailable for the historians or does not exist anymore. When I consulted the official historians and chiefs of archives of France and Great Britain, I was offered an explanation that, okay, if the document was written in German, it could be classified as a worthless German paper and destroyed after the war. So it's quite possible that we will be never ever able to find the document and to document in an absolutely convincing way the scope of the contribution of Polish codebreakers to the Enigma history. Fortunately, 3 years ago, the French Secret Service decided to declassify a set of files captured at home of this man, the same Gustave Bertrand we've been talking about in a later stage of his life. He was a retired military. He was mayor of the wonderful Théoule-sur-Mer in the Mediterranean. But the night after his death, the soldiers representing French military entered his home and sequestered a big part of his private archive, because they suspected, not without the reason, that General Bertrand could be keeping at a private home many documents related to his past duties in the French secret services. And the brief overview of the inventory of the documents declassified by the French military in 2015 was enough to discover that those documents represents only a part of Bertrand's archive. Among those documents, I found a document titled Enigma, kurzgefasste Darstellung der Auflösungsmethoden. Enigma, abridged presentation of the solution methods. And the bare fact that it was written in German convinced me that it might be somehow linked to the missing piece of evidence, to that original period report. And I was right, because in another report filed in one of the British archives, commanding officers of Polish Cipher Bureau noted that sometime during the work of the Polish codebreakers in the southern France, General Bertrand, well, at the time he was not a general yet, he was only a colonel, asked our codebreakers to prepare a document presenting the contribution of all the three nations to the Enigma codebreaking. Having reviewed the effect of their work, he decided that he must rewrite the document from the scratch, because when reading it in the present form, one has an impression that the contribution of French was negligible. That report is of course related somehow to other documents compiled by Polish codebreakers, in particular to so-called Document L, which we know that was prepared in 1940, in the first half of 1940, representing an appendix to the official reports of commanding officer of the Polish Cipher Bureau, Colonel Langer, from the pre-war activities of his subordinates. But that document L was an attempt to recreate the scope of the Polish contribution without any access to their archives, because the Poles, when escaping during the September campaign in 1939 from Warsaw to the Romanian frontier, have lost their archives. They were forced to burn the existing archives, they were forced to bury the remaining machinery, and what they escaped with their own lives only. Therefore, the document L represents not even 50% of the volume of the newly discovered document. There is also another document stemming from the same source, Memories of Marian Rejewski, I've mentioned already. Those filed in 1967 in the archive of the Polish military. Well, the distance of over 30 years from the events caused that document to be also much more general than the document we are analyzing today. Therefore, I have very good reasons to believe that the documents discovered in the French archive represents nothing else than an abridged, abbreviated version of the original period report, probably with a full access to the source documentation preserved in the French archives. From the point of view of historians, that document brings a couple of new information, a couple of new pieces of evidence. To give you a brief overview of what have we learned new about the pre-war achievements of Polish codebreakers, first of all, let's say that reports by Dilly Knox were stating that Poles were able to break the Enigma ciphers until the late fall of 1938. During the Munich crisis, the Germans decided to change the structure of their messages and to introduce two new rotors. That change affected, of course, the efficiency of the work of the Polish codebreakers, but they responded in a brilliant way. They've designed, during a period of about a month, two new methods of breaking the cipher. The first one was the Rejewski bomb, that machine that is a direct predecessor of Turing's bomb. And then Zygalski sheets. Zygalski sheets were representing another response of the group of the Polish codebreakers to that change from 1938. And the newly discovered document confirms that they were efficient, that it is not true that the Poles were breaking Enigma only until the end of 1938. In fact, Poles were breaking the Enigma ciphers until the very last days before the outbreak of World War II. In fact, the last day that was broken was August 25th, the day of German general mobilization. And we learn it from that document. Another change in German ciphering procedures came before the outbreak of the French campaign. Cipher was changed on May the 1st, 1940, and that was the reason of my hand waving during Dermot's presentation, because on that very day the Zygalski sheets lost their importance. Zygalski sheets were no more applicable for Enigma code breaking because an element they were basing on vanished from the German ciphering procedure. And the continuation of Enigma code breaking was possible only to the work of a British code breaker, of John Harriwell, who invented a method known as Harriwell tip. However, Harriwell tip, to be applied efficiently, requires one particular piece of information, require the information about the turnover points, about the turnover notches on the Enigma rotors. And while Poles were able to identify the turnover points of the old rotors long before the outbreak of World War II, you remember that in September 1938, two new rotors were added to Enigma. And the turnover notches of those two rotors were known, better or worse, with some approximation only. What the Poles did in April 1940, working in France, in that wonderful building at Château de Vignoles, which now, by the way, belongs to King of Morocco, summer residence of King of Morocco in France, was determining finally and precisely the position of the turnover notches in rotors number 4 and 5, and only delivering this information to the British counterparts permitted the Harriwell method to be used efficiently. So even in that British success, Poles had their modest share. Oh, I'm afraid it's hardly legible for you. Okay, let me explain then what we are.
It's German anyway.
So German is any obstacle for you? You, a guy coming from Poznan? In that statement, Polish codebreakers express their satisfaction based on the fact that the British colleagues were able to implement one of their theoretical ideas. Zygalski sheets, mentioned a bit earlier, was a special form of the catalog indicating the place where so-called females appeared in an Enigma cipher. Female is a situation when in the distance of 3 characters, one letter is enciphered twice as the same letter. A, in a distance of 3 letters, is encoded as A, B, and B, and so on, and so on, and so on. But Zygalski sheet contained only the information about the existence of the female, and they didn't describe the nature of that female, whether we are dealing with A, B, C, and so on. Poles, long before World War II, were thinking about preparation of another catalog which would facilitate breaking of Enigma cipher, indicating which particular letter appeared as a female. But unfortunately, working in a very, very narrow team, they were unable to implement their own idea. Unfortunately, during the meeting at Pyry, they've communicated that idea to their British colleagues, and the British colleagues were able to implement it efficiently using the machinery constructed by a British mathematician, John Jeffreys. And therefore, that catalog was known in Bletchley Park as Jeffreys sheets. But Jeffreys and his team were only the manufacturers of those sheets and that catalog, and the idea came from the Polish codebreakers. On May the 1st, Germans delivered a heavy blow to everyone, to the French, Polish, and to the British codebreakers, because they've changed the ciphering procedure so that the Zygalski sheets were no more efficient. They couldn't be applied. They have been a basic tool for breaking Enigma ciphers during the first month of World War II, but they were not any more efficient after May the 1st. However, from the declassified report we learned that the German cipher clerks committed a mistake which cost them a lot, because some of the cipher clerks decided to use the new procedure the day before it was valid, and the day before the period, the start of the period when the procedure was designed for. Unfortunately for the Allied codebreakers, Poles were able to break the key to Enigma for April 30th, when this new procedure was used by several clerks in error. And therefore they were able to very easily identify the nature of the new procedure. And when the nature of the new procedure was determined, it was much easier to attack it. So I told you that they were sidetracked in 1940. But as we see in May, this cooperation between the British, Polish, and French codebreakers was still in full swing. And now comes something really interesting. Because from the books about Enigma, we learned that while breaking of the Wehrmacht and Luftwaffe Enigma was an area where the Poles had some contribution, the breaking of the Kriegsmarine Enigma was a pure British adventure. And now we discover that the story is also just a kind of disinformation, or at least some distorted version of the history. Because the authors of the declassified report describe their work on the German Kriegsmarine Enigma from the years starting in 1926, I would say. They were watching the evolution of the German Kriegsmarine ciphers, starting from a particular version of Enigma which was introduced to the Kriegsmarine in 1926. It was a machine without the switchboard, without the Steckerboard. Then it was replaced by Enigma M3, which is more or less identical to the Enigma used in the land forces and the air force. However, at the beginning, and we are learning about that from that document only, it was provided with 5 rotors instead of 3, which at the time were being used in the military, in the common military Enigma. But sometime, if I do remember well, in 1930, the Germans, for the reasons unknown, have withdrawn those 2 additional rotors. And Kriegsmarine Enigma was thus reduced to the machine functionally identical to the Wehrmacht or Luftwaffe Enigma. So the Polish codebreakers, who have somehow noticed that fact, have backtracked and have read archival messages registered in their archives, which permitted them to identify not only the ciphering procedures used by the German Kriegsmarine, but also some stereotype beginnings, endings of the messages, and in fact they were able to recover entire communication of the German Kriegsmarine reaching to the 1920s. Then, once they were able to break the current ciphers, they continued to do so. Until the change which the Germans implemented in 1937. In 1937, German Kriegsmarine and Kriegsmarine only implemented a new ciphering procedures. Do you remember the bigram tables, the sheet printed in red ink that Dermot presented? Those bigram tables were used to encipher the indicators of individual messages sent by the Kriegsmarine. Other branches of the German military were used Enigma for the same purpose. Individual key designed for ciphering the Enigma message was being enciphered using the same Enigma. So once you broke a key for a given day, the rest of traffic was open for you. Kriegsmarine was more reasonable. Kriegsmarine was enciphering the individual indicators to the messages using a different cipher, using a bigram substitution. And the net effect of that change was that breaking the key, the daily key for Enigma, was nothing when you were dealing with Enigma ciphers, because you still had to know the bigram tables used to encipher the individual message key. Fortunately, another error permitted Poles to overcome the crisis. One of the German torpedo boats, using the call sign AFA, did not receive the keys on time and was allowed to use the new ciphering procedures but using the old keys. Poles were able to decode the traffic comprising some 8 to 10 days of the new procedure, and that was enough to determine the structure of the ciphering procedure, to determine some of the habits of the German cipher clerks. Unfortunately, they were not able to expand their break-in because Polish signals intelligence was receiving not enough traffic of the German Kriegsmarine, and they were not having enough cipher material at their disposal. So all they did was including that information in the report and passing it over to the British. And now it comes something new, because from those documents we learn that the British never ever surpassed the point reached by the Polish codebreaker before World War II on the ground of cryptologic theory only. The Poles advanced the attack on the Kriegsmarine cipher to that point exactly that was available for Alan Turing and his colleagues until 1941. Until 1941, British codebreakers were attacking the archival messages of Kriegsmarine, and in some isolated cases were even registering success, but were unable to break operationally on a daily basis Kriegsmarine ciphers due to the lack of the bigram tables. And it was only the capture of the bigram tables on board of U-110 that permitted them to start an operation of the regular breaking of Kriegsmarine ciphers. But on the ground of crypto theory only, they hadn't advanced the attack on those ciphers even a step further than the position reached by the Polish codebreakers before the outbreak of World War II. And at the end of the document, there is a very particular section. Remember that quotation from Colonel Langer's report regarding the purpose that the report was prepared for? To outline the contribution of the three participating countries to Enigma code breaking. And yes, indeed, at the end of the document, as a section 38, there is a section titled Teilnahme der drei Staaten an der Lösung der Enigma, participation of three states in the solution of Enigma. And that's a very particular list, and I do not wonder that it made Bertrand furious, because this is what it looked like. This is a list of the Polish contribution to the Enigma breaking. This is British, and this is French. So I leave it up to you whether we are closer to the truth about Enigma or whether we know the whole and real story about the Enigma code breaking. Thank you very much.
Marek, thank you for that. That was truly a fascinating exposition. Are there questions or comment that people have got? I think there's probably a microphone which may improve the quality for the recording. Questions or there's a hand at the back. Yeah, excellent.
Because actually I don't know any German, so what does the French actually do to the Enigma code breaking?
They have delivered two important documents.
Thank you.
By the way, only one of those documents was effectively used by Polish corporations. Only one.
Thank you very much then.
Sorry, there's a question here. Yes.
No, in general, could you possibly tell us a little bit more about Rejewski after the Second World War? It seems a very, certainly I checked in Wikipedia, but it seems it's incredibly mysterious history, and so there is nothing mentioned about it in Wikipedia. At least I assume he had to be committed somehow to keep secrecy toward the MI5, respectively.
He was not suicidal.
He was not suicidal, you know.
No.
Well, do you like really sad stories?
I don't understand why his life after the Second World War was so, let's say, boring or so ordinary life. And you know, he was tracked by security service under surveillance for a couple of years. I wonder,
You've answered your question yourself.
No, it comes from Wikipedia, all I'm talking about now. But I wonder whether, did you try to get access to those files on him? Is it something
They are available at the Institute of the National Remembrance.
I'm aware.
And they represent a very interesting lecture because, for instance, his daughter, Mrs. Janina Sylwestra, was very impressed by those files when she found in those files a letter written to her by her boyfriends from this period. They were supervised so closely that the security service intercepted even the letters to the family. It was probably interesting for her to recover a letter written from her boyfriend from some 30 years ago. Okay, if you like sad stories, let's go for it. Grajewski was the only one member of the Cipher Bureau that decided to return to Poland. And he did that most probably because he was very loyal to his family. Let's not forget that in September 1939, when he was leaving Warsaw, he has left in Poland his wife and 2 children. Son was about half a year old. I found information that before returning to Poland, he had a very, very serious conversation with Colonel Stefan Meyer, which was an ex-head of the Polish intelligence service. And Meyer tried to convince him not to return to Poland because that would be equivalent to a clear and obvious danger to his life. In particular, considering that at the final stage of World War II, Grajewski participated in breaking of the Soviet ciphers. And moreover, immediately before his return to Poland, he was dispatched to a training which bore a very neutral name, the Training in Military Administration. And in fact, under that cover name was a special training for the intelligence service operators. We don't know whether the Polish authorities really considered Grajewski as a candidate for the intelligence network in Poland, or was it just an effect of the military automatism? However, he decided to return to Poland and he landed in harbor in Gdynia in summer 1946. His flat in Warsaw was occupied by the accidental people. You know, Warsaw was destroyed after the Warsaw Uprising and after World War II, so the property rights did not count too much. And therefore he had to settle down somewhere, and he chose the flat of his parents in Bydgoszcz, in his native Bydgoszcz, where he was trying to get a job. But on the very first day, his actions were being very closely monitored by the Communist Secret Service, and wherever he appeared looking for a job, he was initially accepted. And then, after his obvious skills make him eligible for a promotion, a few sad guys appeared in the factory or in the bureau arguing, we don't think he's a good candidate for a promotion, he'd better be fired. So Grajewski was changing his occupation on a regular basis. But in general, yes, he was working in a profession closely related to his discipline, for his scientific discipline to mathematics. He was working as an accountant. One rather unknown fact about Grajewski is that he was politically a bit naive. And we know it from a single letter contained in that file you are mentioning. In 1956, after the death of Stalin and after the events here in Poznan, when the regime was replaced by the new government in this country by Gomułka, he decided to somehow use his pre-war experiences and filed an application to join the cipher service of the Polish army. And of course, he was immediately rejected. After some time, he moved from, well, after retiring in 1967, he moved to Warsaw, to his old flat in Warsaw. And he enjoyed a very short period of popularity when, after the publication of Bertrand's book, a bunch of journalists and historians appeared in his flats asking him about the details of his pre-war activities. But he didn't enjoy it for a long time. He passed away in February 1980. And in fact, I would say he died without knowing the extent of his own influence on the future of the cryptography and probably the future of the computing. Because I always keep on repeating that from Rejewski's bomb through Turing's bomb to Colossus leads a natural and clear path of technological evolution to the early computers. One might say that Rejewski's bomb was one of those elements which triggered somehow the evolution of the machinery leading towards the early electronic computers. It was a very sad story, but probably one of the best ones for the entire team. If you want to know even sadder stories, let's have a conversation about that after our meeting.